Noor, welcome to the Network State Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Balaji. This is awesome.
Awesome. Great. So I was thinking we could start by just giving an overview of what Orchid is, what embryo screening is, maybe what DNA is, just very, very basics. People don't know anything about this. And then also kind of what you're shipping. And let's get into the moral case, right? Why it's actually important that, if you're on the left and you believe in my body, my choice, which I think you and I do, then obviously, you're going to want that to extend to everything. And if you're on the right and you believe in deregulation, decentralization, like allowing people, basically a libertarian kind of view, then again, you should come to this, to such the idea that people's personal choices are their own business. And certainly a parent shouldn't be forced to do something that another parent or person wants them to do who's not really involved in their relationship. So why don't we though start with the first part, and let's talk about the technology, and let's talk about the morality, and then the society. So you got some slides, got some visuals.
So what Orchid is it allows parents to protect their children in a way that hasn't been possible before. And what we're able to do is we're able to screen the entire genome of an embryo to scan for thousands of diseases that previously parents didn't have the chance to know about until after the child was born, after symptoms already developed, after a doctor has a really awful conversation with the parent that sort of ends with there's not much that we can do. So we basically give all of that information at the earliest possible stage when there is actually something that you can do, which is to transfer an embryo that's unaffected. So let's kind of start at the very beginning of the birds and the bees. How does an embryo actually form? So what is an embryo? An embryo is an egg plus a sperm. Each gamete, egg and sperm are carrying 23 chromosomes that combines to create a zygote, an embryo that grows. So you can actually see this is how an embryo develops over those 5 days that it grows in the lab. So what happens is that it divides into multiple cells. On day 5, you have about 125 cells. 5 of those cells are sampled from the outer membrane, which is called the trophectoderm. And those are the ones that are actually used in Orchid's analysis. So this process of actually biopsying or giving a haircut to embryos has actually been happening for over 2 decades. It's just that in that 5-cell biopsy that only has 30 picograms of DNA, historically you haven't been able to get very much information off of that. You only got something called chromosome information, right? Which you can kind of think of as like chapters in a book, versus what Orchid's able to do is actually read every single letter, every single base in those chapters, as opposed to just that.
Now, here's the thing. The thing is, this doesn't look, at the 1 or 2 or 4 or 8 or 16 cell or whatever cell stage, it really doesn't look human, right? It is very much, you can decide. You take a continuous process, and every ethicist and every person will have a different point on that process as to when it's a human being, right? But probably most would agree that, well, actually, no, some wouldn't, that the sperm and egg are themselves, there's biblical injunctions against spilling one seed on the ground and so on and so forth, right? So if you think it's actually a, quote, human at the moment of an embryo, then you'll have one set of moral intuitions. And if you think it's not really a human then, but it might become a human 3 months or 6 months or whatever months from now, that's, the whole termination debate or what have you.
Yeah,
really,
I think
it's important to put this on screen because that, what you just put there, it really doesn't look like a human. If you told machine learning to ask, does that look like a human or not? It's not, doesn't look like a human, right? And whether it looks like something is not everything, but it's something, in the sense of it's a microscopic little cluster of cells that, legal systems will differ based on whether or not you consider this to, quote, be a human or not, right? And many legal systems do not consider it to be a human. This is like one of those things where it's like,
I totally agree. I think it's very clear that this is not visible to the naked eye. It's there's no organs.
Oh yeah, and how small is it? You haven't indicated that on screen.
Yeah, it's not visible to the naked eye, right? So this is under a microscope.
Like you can't see this without a microscope.
No, if you were to see a petri dish, you would not be able to see anything, right? It's like smaller than a grain of sand. But I think
So
even separate from that, like the question of, is it human, is it not? Like the core thing is that Orchid doesn't actually change anything about the IVF process, right? The way that IVF works, the way that it's worked for 40 years is that you extract eggs, you create embryos, you create multiple embryos, and you have to choose one to transfer, right? So if you're opposed to creating embryos, then you should just be opposed to IVF in general, which is where, 12 million plus babies have been born, right? The,
right,
the thing that Orchid is doing is saying that, hey, you have these, 4, 5, 6, 10, 15 embryos, however many embryos that you were able to create during that cycle. And the question is, which one do you transfer? The previous method is that you transfer with extremely limited information. And then with Orchid, you have the opportunity to have much more information. So there isn't actually a new moral question of should we create embryos or not, or should we transfer embryos or not, right? That question has already been decided by IVF. And this question of, which embryo do we transfer is just inherent in every single IVF cycle, right? If you create more than one embryo, then that decision has to be made. It's just that right now it's made via kind of a beauty contest. So what will happen is that an embryologist will look at these images and say, okay, this one has a higher morphological grade, this one has a lower morphological grade. Or alternatively, they'll use really limited genetic information. So that's kind of chromosome testing, what I'm going to get into, right? So, humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. And if you have a abnormal number of chromosomes, then it's frequently not compatible with life, right? So the chromosomes are organized from largest to smallest, meaning the number of genes, the number of bases that are on chromosome 1 is much larger than on the sex chromosomes are much smaller. So most of if you have a monosomy, meaning a missing chromosome or an extra chromosome on most of these chromosomes are just not compatible with life. A sort of unique situation where it is compatible with life is Down syndrome, trisomy 21. And I guess kind of the key point here is really, if someone asked you to proofread your book and the only thing that they could tell you is, your book has an extra or missing chapter, you wouldn't really think that was a very good proofreader, right? But that's really all that existing genetic testing can tell you is do you have on embryos anyways, is do you have an extra or missing chromosome? So what whole genome sequencing and what Orchid can do is go much, much further. It goes actually really deep into every single letter in each of those chromosomes or chapters, right? So any type of typo, whether that's an extra base, an insertion, a missing base, a deletion, those can all be detected. So there's actually thousands of different genetic diseases that have been cataloged by geneticists, in the academic community over the last 2 decades. And, what's really powerful is being able to actually scan for these ahead of time rather than after it's too late, right? Like you probably don't know a lot about, the names of a lot of these conditions, neuroocular disorder, like individually, each of these conditions is really rare, but in aggregate, if you add them up, a lot of people are affected. So, if you look at like the rare disease community, they'll say that 10% of Americans are affected by rare disease, and the vast majority of those are genetic. The vast majority of those who are affected are children, and 95% of these conditions don't even have treatments, much less a cure. So what's really cool is that this is already happening, right? Like babies have already been born, through Orchid that have been screened for this, that have had their entire genome screened. And, the reason why this is really powerful is that if you look at pretty much every single outcome, whether it's pregnancy or healthy baby, a huge component, a double-digit component, is actually genetic, right? So if you look at miscarriage, about 50% of miscarriages are due to genetic issues in the embryo, right? So there's people who have recurrent miscarriages due to genetics that, if they do embryo screening, don't have to, suffer that same fate. If you look at infant deaths, over a quarter of infant deaths in the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit, are due to underlying genetic diseases. Again, this is like a huge category of sort of the maximum amount of suffering that you can imagine for a parent and a child that could just be totally avoided via embryo screening. And if you look at another category like moderate to severe intellectual disability, about 60%, there's about a 60% diagnostic yield for those folks. And, a large fraction of these are caused by what's called de novo mutations. So that means that there's new or spontaneous mutations in the embryo that are not present in the parents. And A lot of these are paternally inherited, meaning older fathers are contributing more de novo mutations.
So just interrupt for a second. IVF already exists.
Yes.
Pre-implantation diagnosis already exists.
Yes.
Most people who do this, millions of people have done this, millions of people are already screening. And they're already screening for example, moderate to severe intellectual disability, because if you're actually doing it, why would you not, right?
So this screening, the moderate to severe intellectual disability, this is happening in the pediatric setting, right? So a child will come in and they'll be affected, right, with either, autism or intellectual disability or epilepsy, and then geneticists will sequence them and find out what the cause is, right? The only difference is that instead of waiting until after symptoms happen, we're moving that timeline all the way up to the embryo, because now we have this new ability, which is we're able to actually sequence the entire genome of the embryo rather than just this tiny fraction, just the chromosomes. But
right.
Yeah, sorry.
So actually, that's right. So some fraction things can be caught preconception or even even before people are married or what have you, because you can sequence or carrier test them. But many other things that are de novo, you can only catch post-conception, but potentially post-conception, but pre-implantation.
Yes,
Because
exactly. Right? Yeah, and I think a really important piece here is that right now the situation is that, we talked about chromosome testing, right? So via NIPT, pregnant mothers at 10 or 15 weeks are already getting information about chromosomes, right? They're already finding out, okay, my child has Down syndrome, and now they have an option, right? Which is either terminate or have an affected child, right? They're already put in that position, right? And people are already choosing to terminate or already choosing to, continue those pregnancies, right? So it's fully sort of more compassionate from a emotional, physical level to just move that timeline forward to the point of transferring an embryo, as opposed to
pre-implantation rather than post-implantation.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
So that's what's kind of really surprising to
just to define terms, right? There's there's just screening an adult and giving them their genome before they're, having any partner of any kind. Then there is, let's call it preconception testing, which is similar, except the difference being that now your genome and your partner's genome are being analyzed together to determine whether or not your children will potentially have, for example, a chance of having a double recessive if both parents have a Mendelian disease. Yeah. Then there is post-conception, when the embryo exists, but pre-implantation, which is in the context of IVF, where you've got the 9 embryos, for example, in your diagram, and they're these tiny microscopic grain of sand things. And then there is post-implantation, when the embryo is actually in the mother's womb and it's developing, and then you're screening that.
Yes, exactly. And basically at each of those levels, different amounts of information are being revealed, right? So
correct. That's right.
Carrier screening only looks at recessive disorders, right? But we're saying, hey, you probably care about dominant disorders, right? You care about cancer, right? But that's just missing from carrier screening, right? So it's
exactly. So in a sense, if you make a distinction in an embryo and a 3-month-old fetus, which most people I think do,
yes,
by moving more testing, now of course IVF itself is a procedure and a significant one, and so on and so forth. But if someone's doing IVF, then because you can screen pre-implantation, you can catch things so that you don't have to screen post-implantation when it's actually developing in the womb. It's actually a more, as you said, more compassionate kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? I mean, maybe it's obvious, but the main cost of that is doing IVF in the first place. And that's a whole separate topic, but we want to reduce the cost of doing IVF. We want to reduce the overhead. A lot of people are working on that.
And I think, exactly. And I think even to focus on IVF, right? So we've also already resolved the moral question of should people be allowed to do IVF electively, right? So egg freezing and IVF are identical processes. The question is just, do you freeze the eggs or do you actually fertilize the eggs? But essentially, women who are perfectly fertile, they have no infertility issue, are already using IVF, using egg freezing prophylactically, right? Proactively to basically, preserve their fertility, right? So this idea that IVF can be used electively without an infertility diagnosis has actually also already been resolved for the last 10 years, right? So even that question of, should people be using IVF who don't have an infertility issue, I think that question has already been answered, right? It used to be the case that egg freezing was only recommended for women who had, a cancer diagnosis, right? They were going to be doing chemotherapy, and then it was an option to preserve their fertility, right? But over the last decade, it's sort of advanced beyond that. It's no longer experimental. Millions of people have done that procedure as well, right? And obviously gay parents are using IVF, to form their families too. So I think it's really sort of, I think at this point it's already a personal decision. Do you want, to use IVF to form your family? So again, it's sort of just like, okay, now once you've made the decision to use IVF, how much information do you want? Do you want a little bit of information, or do you want sort of the maximum amount of information that science can provide?
Hmm.
Yeah, so kind of just moving on, right? So I really wanted to kind of focus on this monogenic case because this is sort of, I would say, um, you know, very clinically bulletproof in the sense that, look, all of these conditions are already screened for in the pediatric setting, in the adult setting. There's no debate about, if you have this variant, does it lead to these disease, right? They're all considered definitively associated with these diseases. So it's really just about, moving that timeline forward. I'd say the second side of the testing is using what's called I guess, so just to kind of like hammer that point home on the monogenic side, right? So we have users who've had, children who have terminal disorders, right? So this is a child that has this brain disorder called lissencephaly. Vast majority of children with this condition die before they're 10 years old. There's no cure. So I think it's honestly, I think, quite cruel to in any way stigmatize these parents, right? They've sort of given up their entire careers to be caregivers for these very severely affected children, and now they want the opportunity to have a child that is healthy, that doesn't have to suffer from terminal condition in the same way that their first child did. And I think that that's an extremely important, vulnerable population to embrace rather than to somehow stigmatize. And I just feel extremely strongly about these families. I mean, this is kind of like the reason why I started the company. So yeah, I just think if people understood what it is that they're going through, it's like a very human desire, right? The idea that you want to see your child grow up, grow old, rather than having to bury them, right? And this is the
Yeah,
reality.
this is all the people who are like, just roll the dice. What about the people who didn't want to roll the dice and they got a very bad roll of the dice and very bad luck, right? Um, there's no point in, just roll the dice is just some silly type of thing that people will say without actually thinking about the consequences of it for people they don't know, um, like Mrs. Crown over here.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're not on the hook for the lifetime, of medical bills, right? And I think that it's not diminishing, this baby's life or anyone's life to screen and to say, hey, for my next child, I don't want them to be affected by that condition. I think that's kind of one of the tensions that I think people somehow don't understand. That hey, if I choose not to drink during my pregnancy, that's not saying all people with fetal alcohol syndrome should be deleted. It's saying for me, for my child, I don't want them to be affected by fetal
Of
alcohol.
course, these arguments that some of these folks are making are just so silly because it's like saying, I think we should put on seatbelts. So I was in a car crash. Do you think I shouldn't exist?
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly the same. It's sort of like,
It just makes,
no, everyone is
actually,
equally.
I want fewer people being hurt by car crashes. Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And if anything, it's sort of like even more unfair than a car crash because hey, it's like okay, there's like a clear human error, 90% of the time for why that car crash happened. This is sort of like okay, you just a random typo just got added to your DNA, and then you just your organs don't form, your limbs don't form, your skull doesn't form, right? So it can just be very catastrophic.
It's like there's a meme about like, did you have breakfast today? They
Yeah.
genuinely can't contemplate a counterfactual. Fundamentally, the the concept, really what it boils down to, I think, is misery loves company.
Mhm.
People who have some form of bad thing happen to them just want other people to also be miserable. Some of them, others don't. Right? Why don't we go to the next slide, Mark?
Well, actually, I don't know, Balaji. I kind of like basically me saying something and then you doing your commentary over it.
Go.
So I actually think that's kind of good. Like, do you want to do this summary really quick of like what all of this means? I actually thought that was really good. If you want to just like have one final
Yeah,
thought.
I mean, my summary is, and but we'll edit and pull everything out.
Yeah.
My summary is A, we've got 12 million IVF babies. B, we already are doing diagnosis prior to implantation of IVF babies. C, we have the opportunity to improve that diagnosis by simply adding polygenic scoring on top of monogenic scoring. D, it's a parent's decision as to whether to do that or not. E, it is not somebody else's decision really as to obviously whether those parents got married in the first place, how they choose to have children, whether they choose to have children. F, much of the hand-wringing over this is based on bizarre, illogical emotionalism that doesn't encounter the reality of what it is to have a child with a genetic disorder and to make somebody else roll the dice of doing that. It's kind of like, I prefer a car without seatbelts, therefore you must have a car without seatbelts.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that. You're literally preventing somebody else from taking a precaution because you want to roll the dice. Okay. I mean, fine. If you want to roll the dice, be my guest. Why should somebody else have to do that again? Why should some other parent?
I also think it would be good if you just did one quick recap of like, what are the moral questions here, right? Which is like, okay, should we create embryos? That's already been discussed.
Right. So moral questions. And should IVF be legal? Okay. And by the way, we can reverse the same, kind of argument. Do you hate all the IVF babies? Do you hate 12 million people? Do you want them all to be eradicated because you're so anti-IVF? You IVF hater, you IVF bigot, blah, 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 right? Like you can reverse all these retarded arguments on them. Okay, fine. So, number one, should IVF be legal? Okay, if yes, all right. Number two, should pre-implantation genetic diagnosis be legal? Which it is. Which is basically like if you've got embryo, and by the way, you need that because IVF embryos often have something wrong with them, aneuploidies or something like that. So you have to screen them before implantation. So screen them for aneuploidies, which are macroscopic chromosomal issues. Why wouldn't you screen them for microscopic ones, which are like monogenic disorders? And if you can do that, now that we've got the technology, why not polygenic? There's really no, or probably minimal added cost. I assume the amplification step to actually get the DNA from there and screen it. It's like minimal biochemical added costs. Let me put it like that. There might be fixed costs in terms of doing the data analysis and so on. So if you're screening, should be able to do aneuploidies? Almost certainly yes. Monogenic? Absolutely. That's already really standard of care and many parents choose it. And polygenic? Guess what? First of all, it's already happening. And second of all, you can't draw the line for somebody else to marry somebody. So they're already picking the genes of the other partner. If they want a tall partner or a partner who's good at frisbee, like that's already their choice, right? They're already in a sense
and also
the genes.
to be clear, right? The biggest impact on your embryos is going to be your partner. It's never going to be the case that your embryo screening is going to have a bigger. 50% of the DNA you're choosing right there. So
right,
yeah.
So like obviously that's not roll of the dice. You're completely intentional about partner choice,
Mm-hmm.
and so this is just really, editing around that equilibrium. It's like plus minus whatever percent around that 50% that you've already got in there. So, many medical procedures, by the way, heart transplants, there are people who attack that as necrophilia, right? Actually recently, fecal transplants, which sound gross, have actually been really valuable for people with IBS or other kinds of things to fix their gut microbiome. And, obviously there's a lot of people who are mad about the thing is, it's one thing to be mad maybe specifically about a specific aspect of the COVID vaccine, but a lot of people have just turned that into being against the germ theory of disease writ large. Like they generally don't understand Koch postulates or transmission pathogenesis. They just don't understand the immune system or how vaccines even work. And of course, there's like, stupidity on both sides, many sides on that issue. But the point being that many medical procedures, if you just describe them to like a medieval peasant,
they'd be disturbed by them.
It's like it is extremely repugnant seeming, right? Like, so first of all, just any organ transplant.
You could basically make the argument that, if you break your leg, then didn't God want you to be unable to walk for the rest of your life?
Yes.
Maybe you could, but you could also say, hey, look, why don't we put a cast on it and see if it gets better. That's like the
So like for example, organ transplants are an obvious one. Isn't that like defiling the dead or what have you, right? Like necrophilic. Okay. Blood transfusions, very similar, right?
Yeah.
Wisdom of repugnance would not actually be that wise. Number three,
Epidural. People used to have a huge moral panic around epidural, right?
That's right. Actually, doctors also not
pregnancy.
doctors used to not tell tell a patient if they had cancer,
Yeah,
right? They would keep that information from patients. Seems like a
yeah.
pretty big deal. Very, very, very in loco parentis, type of thing. Um, I mean, there's so many things, like essentially modern medicine, even hand washing was fought tooth and nail. Some
Y-
used to have a huge problem with that. Like people didn't like him. Um, many, many things that are innovations in medicine. I
Even
mean, just
NICU.
even the
Yeah.
analysis of go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, yeah, even
Urine samples, stool samples, blood samples, you know, analyzing all that stuff, analyzing all those fluids. There's a disgust reflex with that.
mhm.
Um, like a lot of medicine is gross, right? Like if you
Surgery is gross, right? The idea of cutting someone open, fixing something.
surgery is gross, all this stuff, of course, you have, I mean, there's all kinds of blood everywhere in the operating room on a surgery. If you were just walking on that, you're like, you're hurting him, stop, blah, 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 blah. And, you wouldn't understand anesthesia. Basically, these are just things where the intuitions of a medieval peasant can only really get you so far, right? The caveman mentality, yeah. So sometimes there's a utility to it, right? Where sometimes there's something that feels weird and actually is bad or what have you, right?
Mhm.
But the problem, and one of the issues is, um, that much of the modern scientific establishment has said, for example, like XX and XY don't exist, right?
Mhm.
Like
Yeah.
that chromosomes aren't functional and so on. So I actually understand where the sort of medieval peasant mentality came from, or why it came back, because they just went back to extreme basics and just relied on their intuitions as a caveman. But those intuitions are going to be different from person to person also, right? So they're not scalable across society. They're very tribal.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it's coming back. So basically, I think what'll eventually happen with all of this, by the way, and let's go back to your slides. But I think what's going to go start it. Yeah, go. No. You should.
Yeah, yeah. I think I just have like 5 more minutes and then
Okay,
we can get into it. So basically,
sure.
if you I think a lot of people really underestimate what the power of a base pair is, right? You have A, T, C, G. People are like, oh, maybe it doesn't really matter if you swap an A for a T, right? So I'm gonna try to really illustrate and show you kind of what the impacts of a single base pair are, right? So this is, the tallest man in the world. This is the shortest woman in the world. And these conditions, gigantism and achondroplasia, are really caused by, a single letter change, right? So you're talking about a single letter in a single gene that
That's a
results
very good slide. Great
in
slide.
these, dramatically different, you know, essentially what happens in gigantism is that, your pituitary system goes into overdrive and sort of a massive amount of growth hormone gets dumped and you become, extremely tall. And, conversely, in achondroplasia, people who are much, much shorter, they have a critical protein that's broken that doesn't allow, normal growth
Yeah,
to happen.
and actually, if I recall correctly, that particular variant is something that's more common among um, sperm of older men. That it's like a hypermutable region or something like that that tends to tend to see more achondroplasia in children of older men. That there's some sort of that part of the genome is actually more susceptible to mutation in that particular way, which is an
It might
interesting.
be the case. I actually don't know if, like, the full etiology of both of these diseases. I just think that, when you're looking at that previous slide where we're talking about, these thousands of different diseases, a lot of these are honestly are fatal or extremely serious. People don't have an emotional reaction to it because they don't know someone with, arterial calcification or any of these, sort of diseases that have strange names. They're not very relatable. But I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to get across here is like, it really matters, right? It could be the difference between your child having a terminal condition or not. It could be the difference between, someone, being, very, 3 standard deviations from the norm in terms of height in either direction, right? So these changes do matter, and it's very reasonable for parents to want to scan for this information because it can have, a very significant impact on, their health trajectory. So we kind of already talked about monogenic, so now I'm going to get into polygenic. So again, monogenic is sort of that, single gene, single variant is a specific disease. Polygenic is trying to understand conditions like heart disease, schizophrenia, bipolar, where it's not just driven by a single gene, but rather it's the cumulative effect of many, many different variants across the genome. So, the study design, the way that they actually build these models is pretty simple. They're looking for sequence variation. They have sets of people who are unaffected controls, and then they have people who are affected. So folks who have schizophrenia, folks who have bipolar, and then they're looking for enrichment. So basically which variants are more common in the cases as opposed to the controls. And in terms of the performance, this is what the shape of these curves often look like, right? So you're looking at, how often do people get heart disease and what is the percentile of their risk score? So in the 50th percentile, that's about average. And then what you can see is that there's a really strong risk increase when you get to the much higher percentiles, right? The 95th plus percentile of risk, right? So that's kind of what the type of risk that we highlight. It doesn't really matter if, the 30th versus the 70th percentile, because a very small increase in risk. But if you're at the tails of these distributions, there is a very strong signal from that genetic component. So that's kind of what parents can learn. Is that, okay, is my embryo in that low risk or average risk category, or is my embryo in that high risk category?
The thing about it is there's n variables on which you've got curves like this, whether they look exactly like this or not, because that is coronary artery disease. You've got n more that are like that.
Yeah.
And so how do you think about the multivariable aspect of that? Because an embryo that's high on some of these will be low on others.
Yeah. That's actually a great. So I'll actually get into it. So basically, one thing that,
because you're doing best of n across a vector of k variables, where k is usually much greater than n.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that people are really trying to understand is that, if I'm selecting an embryo that's low risk for one condition, does that mean that they're going to conversely be higher risk for another condition? And they've actually already built what's called correlation matrices, where they'll say, okay, is heart disease correlated with atrial fibrillation? Is it correlated with schizophrenia? Is it correlated with bipolar disorder? They've done this.
Yeah, but you wouldn't need to do it that way, because you actually have, if I'm not mistaken, you have actually the raw underlying A's, C's, G's, and T's. So you can form, let's say you have n embryos and you have k conditions on which you're screening for, and then each of those k conditions has m sub k underlying loci, right, that contribute to it, which is a ragged list for each of them, right?
Yeah.
Then you don't have to do the calculations. You can actually go to the exact loci, and you can say, let me calculate the PGS for this n by k table.
Yeah.
And then you can just see,
how many shared variants are there? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So basically, what I'm getting at is, like, what you see is there's an aggregation with diseases that are related. So basically, heart-related conditions, heart disease, atrial fibrillation, those aggregate together. They have a shared architecture. Mental health conditions like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, they aggregate together, right? So what ends up happening is you get to actually reduce risk for multiple conditions at once, right? So an embryo that's, high risk for schizophrenia is also, likely to, there is a shared genetic architecture for other mental health conditions. So, rather than there being a trade-off, what actually happens is that a lot of these conditions that are for similar systems end up actually having those shared variants. So, anyways, I think that's, I'm trying to kind of respond quickly to what people usually, they're sort of immediate.
And how many conditions are you looking at there besides coronary artery disease?
We're looking at about 12. I can kind of give you the full list, but kind of thinking about this, sort of from like the South Asian standpoint, right? If you roll the dice, you might get an average outcome, right? So what if the average outcome is chronic disease, right? So us South Asians, we get heart disease at, 4 times a higher rate than any other ethnic population, right?
Yep.
We're twice as likely to die. 25% of heart attacks occur under 40 for South Asians, and 50% occur under the age of 50. So we're getting heart disease 10 years earlier than the rest of the population, right? So I don't want that to affect my child just because that's something that, a lot of South Asians have. That doesn't mean that I want that to, automatically be a part of, these are one of the biggest causes of death, right? Like, and especially in terms of, reducing the quality of life, right? A heart attack, even if you survive it, it's sort of, you aren't able to run as often. A lot of these consequences of this, right? So the idea that parents shouldn't have access to mitigating the biggest vector in terms of mitigating risk for disease Yeah, I just think it's insane, right? Because what you can see, right? You're just talking about, okay, what are, you're trying to quantify, like from like the math perspective, how much risk reduction is actually possible, and it's really remarkable how much you can get with a really small number of embryos. So this is looking at kind of the worst case scenario, right? So let's say you have two parents, both mom and dad are at high risk. And what you can see is that you can get a 30% risk reduction with 5 embryos with, a pretty, poorly performing model. And if you're and this analysis, by the way, wasn't done by Orchid, it's done by an independent statistical geneticist who just published this paper that I just love these figures that he produced. So then, if you use a slightly better model, you get a 40% risk reduction with 5 embryos. And then with an even better model, you get a 55% risk reduction with just 5 embryos, right? So this is
Interesting. So it starts topping out. Wait a second. So the software gain is the difference between the triangles, the circles, and the squares.
yes.
Okay. So and then once you get to about 9 or so embryos,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So you're seeing this behavior where it starts to flatten out, right? Because you sort of sampled from the distribution in terms of how much risk you can reduce.
On one condition.
Yep, this is on one condition.
Right. But multivariate, the problem is if you're optimizing the minimum risk on one of your 12 things, the other 11 are loose and can have higher risk, right? So you have some weighted sum of them that you're doing this on.
Well, this one is not looking at all. We can look into the methods, but this figure specifically is talking about reducing risk for one condition.
No, I know. But basically, you would have this kind of figure for each of the 12, but reducing risk for, let's say you picked the best of 5 that got you the lowest risk on condition 1, right?
Yeah.
Then conditions 2 through 12, you might have higher risk. So you have to sort of spend your optimization budget.
Yes,
in a certain way.
yes, exactly. So the thing you want to think about is that probably for those other conditions, if you're playing in this realm, it's not going to make a big difference. So you really want to be focusing on what is the condition that your embryos are at high risk for, where there's a really big delta. Right? You want to just get them out of that like 97th plus percentile, which usually for 12 conditions, you're not going to have multiple where you have embryos. Like you're not going to have for multiple diseases that you're in the top 3 percentile of risk, if that makes sense, right? Because if you're playing that's kind of does that make sense? Did I explain that well?
Yeah, totally. Keep going.
Yeah. So, so basically this is kind of like the worst case scenario, right? You're pretty constrained because both mom and dad are high risk, and you still get this pretty massive, right, 30 to 55% risk reduction, right? So people don't really have, again, a good way to conceptualize how massive this risk reduction is. So what I'm trying to compare it to is, this is more powerful than the most successful drugs on the market, right? Drugs that are making, $1 billion a year, right? So here's 2 drugs. You have, a drug for COPD.
There's just basically one obvious point of this is there's just massive healthcare savings from this, potentially, if we can get IVF and so on out there, because just like many
Usually what I'm trying to get people to grok is like medicine is not very good, right? It costs $1 billion and 10 years to get a drug to market.
Or you prefer to be fixed at the genome level rather than labor.
Yeah, but even more than that, I mean, it only has a 30% relative risk reduction. That's what we're comparing, relative risk reduction to relative risk reduction, right? We'll talk about absolute risk reduction later. But the point is that some of the best drugs on the market only get a 30% relative risk reduction. Then you're leashed to that drug for life. And there's side effects, right? If you do this for your embryos, there are no side effects, right? Like you already decided to do IVF, you're picking an embryo. The question is just, do you want that embryo to be at higher risk or lower risk? And then that risk level is the same for life. You don't have to like continually take a drug every single day, right? Because the other thing is that when they do these studies, right, like you don't actually get the benefit if you're not perfectly adherent to the medication, right? And there's entire companies that are built around how do you get someone to actually remember to take a drug every day, right? That's also not trivial, even if you get, a drug to work.
Great.
So yeah, then if you kind of look across the other situations, right, like you might not be in that most constrained situation where both mom and dad are at high risk, right? If you're in the situation where mom and dad are at average risk, you're getting up to an 80% risk reduction, right? And if you're in the situation where one is high and one is low, you're kind of, topping out at maybe 70%, depending on, what the power of that predictor is, how well understood it is. So, yeah, all of this to say that I think this is like a huge area where people can potentially, massively change the trajectory of their child's life with really kind of a like surprisingly minimal cost for like how big of a component the genetics is. And kind of this is kind of what I was trying to talk about earlier, which is, what are the genetic trade-offs, right? So you can build these correlation matrices where you look at which conditions are correlated to which other ones, and you can see that psychiatric conditions, kind of are the most correlated with each other. Cardiovascular conditions are correlated with each other, but schizophrenia is not correlated with height. It's not correlated with type 2 diabetes, right? So it's not the case that you're necessarily trading off risk for one thing for another thing. And people, again, not just Orchid, but the entire physical genetics community has done a ton of work to look into this and to see what are the potential trade-offs or shared architectures between these conditions. Yeah, this is kind of the take-home point, right? Is that having lower genetic risk at birth is likely more powerful than almost anything else that you can do later in life, right? There's no diet, there's no exercise that's going to mitigate risk for schizophrenia, right? There's nothing that can change, the chance that your child has pediatric cancer if they have a specific variant that makes it extremely likely for them to have it, right? So, I don't know. I think it's sort of like this massive benefit that's hiding in plain sight that people are, instead of embracing, they're kind of, coming up with these really, illogical arguments for why it should be stigmatized.
Yep.
Uh,
Basically, the thing is, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna I think sorry. I think this is the last point, right? So sort of like people have actually already surveyed the public and said, what is their opinion about embryo screening for, childhood onset, adult onset, polygenic, monogenic, and the American public is really strongly in favor of this, right? 72% either strongly approve or approve of embryo screening. And here's a number that I think is actually even more surprising, right? So 30% of Americans would either definitely consider or
That's a random sample.
yeah, yeah. It's okay. This is a random sample, and it's also older folks. So I actually think that if you, like, I think the average age was, I think, like 40 or 45, which I think is older than
Fascinating article.
the set of folks who are actually going to be considering having kids. If anything, I think this is an underestimate of how many people would consider doing IVF. And I think this
It's actually a 2024 paper.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that I think people should be really shocked by this number, right? The fact that a third of Americans are considering, hey, I would not have babies the old-fashioned way. I would rather have babies consider using IVF in order to mitigate risk for these conditions that I've been affected by. I think that that's extremely
Interesting. Nationally representative sample,
yeah.
at least for, yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, so I think that this idea that, IVF is somehow like IVF is very different if you are, fertile and you're not struggling with infertility, right? It's sort of like, hey, it's like this inconvenience that you have to be on medication for 2 days. And, it's like for a lot of people, it's like a bad period, right? I'm not trying to diminish, what it's like to fight infertility. It is extremely difficult. If you, have PCOS, endometriosis, a lot of these other conditions, infertility is like equivalent to a cancer diagnosis. But for fertile people, it's an extra, 2 to 3 weeks of discomfort compared to, hey, you're going to have a 9-month pregnancy. You're going to raise this child for life. Do you really want to risk, a condition that you've been affected by or kind of these random genetic typos affecting a child? And I think that a lot of parents are going to say no, right? I mean, even just if you think about miscarriage, right? I mean, it's extremely, it's extremely, emotionally costly to
Oh,
have.
here,
Yeah.
I can share the screen for a second myself. So here is the article that you're just mentioning. I was pulling it up while you're talking. Here is the approval and interest in polygenic embryo screening. This is a 2024 article. And so actually, this is a great figure. 45% approve, 30% strongly approve. Should be allowed 80%. This is an amazing graphic just for the
like,
Twitter bubble, just for people to know. Just FYI, it's like 80% should be allowed. Okay, number one. Then
and it's even
number
higher
two,
for IVF, right? The idea that like there's like
yeah, IVF
very
for the
broad.
purpose of PS use,
Yeah.
exactly. And then approval for various outcomes. So, for health conditions, it's like overwhelmingly there, right? But
Mhm.
even for and psychiatric conditions like mental illness, overwhelmingly there. But even here, it's like close to 50-50,
Mhm.
right? Like, these are looking like, in the sense of uh no opinion, if you delete no opinion in a sense, right? These are close. So it's like maybe it's 5-to-1 ratio or something like that. What's that? Like 80 to 10, 8-to-1 ratio for some of these bars. And here it's like a 1-to-1, right? In the sense of close to 50-50. But that's actually that's what I've called this is non-controversial. And
Yeah.
this is controversial, but in the sense of 50% support and 50% opposition, which means on the order of 50% of states or jurisdictions may actually legalize it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and then, if you look at what conditions and traits and so on, so cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's, diabetes, just basically overwhelming like this, and you get to obesity, and that's actually still pretty high over here. And it's only when you get to skin color that's like extremely negative. Even like intelligence. And again, this is close, right? It's more disapprove than approve, but it's not orders of magnitude. You add up the red and the yellow versus the blue and the other blue over here, neuroticism and so on. So BMI is basically very similar to obesity. So it's interesting that it's different. The phrasing of the question sometimes matters. And then, concerns, interesting paper. Good paper.
Yeah, so I think it's just people don't. You're totally right. There's like a Twitter bubble, and people don't realize that the vast majority.
FYI, 80% of people support embryo screening in a 2024 study.
Yeah, yeah.
Boom.
It's just important.
Actually, send me your deck also because I will preview this. Pod with the with both that and the one base pair, right? Like
Yeah.
is 8'3" versus 2'7". Literally one delta alteration.
So,
Do you really
sorry.
want?
Just I want to give you just one asterisk on that one.
Yeah.
So, I don't have those people's genomes. I just looked up for gigantism and achondroplasia.
Okay. No. So yeah. So we'll
It's not
basically
them
say
specifically. We're not giving them a diagnosis. I'm just saying for gigantism and achondroplasia, these are the single base pair causes of it. So just I'll give you like exact copy if you want of like what those mean. But I just want to give the caveat. It's like we're not giving them a diagnosis. We're saying for people who have gigantism or achondroplasia. So I think I want your commentary on like the moral necessity of this, and then maybe a little bit of your commentary on the scientific side too, because I think I might have gone too deep. So I would like for you to like summarize it because
well, first is,
Yeah.
I mean, on the left, the entire thing for the last 50 years has been my body, my choice. So how could that possibly not extend? How could you define reproductive choice so narrowly as to say it only extends, like you can only terminate in some cases or not others or screen and stuff? That doesn't make any sense at all, right? So just choice alone. So basically everybody who's in favor of reproductive choice on the left should obviously be in favor of embryo screening, or certainly not pushing to ban it, even if they don't do it themselves. If it, as they used to say, if you don't want it, don't have one, right? As for the right, I do understand the social conservative argument. I disagree with it because I think that the quote wisdom of repugnance could be applied to many, 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 many things, right? And what we think of as normal, like circumcision could be considered really bizarre and is considered bizarre in some historical cultures or what have you. Heart transplants would be considered bizarre in some cultures. Certainly past cultures, surgeries, like the screening of blood, urine samples, fecal samples, all that stuff that's like completely normal in any biomedical clinic. If you just go by, oh, that grosses me out, you wouldn't do it. And we have millions of IVF babies, and we have millions of IVF procedures, and we have existing screening for aneuploidies and monogenic disorders. We have all the infrastructure set up. We have 80% support from people, as your paper shows, for screening, even in the West, and it's almost certainly higher in the East, just given the numbers I've seen. And the whole point of the Human Genome Project, billions and billions and billions of dollars, was to use the genome for human health. Like all these taxpayer dollars went into this. So that's yet another argument that is, if you were a taxpayer on this, it's your right to use that information, right? And then you're also choosing your partner, that's 50%. And that certainly wasn't a roll of the dice. And this is like an edit around that. Then moreover, for many populations like South Asians, chronic disease is actually, unfortunately, the average outcome because in the modern environment, modern nutritional environment, we have very high rates of heart disease and of type 2 diabetes and other kinds of conditions. And so you put all that together, and it is really something where some people are just reacting in this really stupid emotional way. And you know what? That's their right for themselves. You know, for themselves, whatever. I'm certainly not saying they should do it if they don't want to do it, but they definitely can't stop somebody else because at some place, some point on the face of the earth, there will be, given that it's controversial, not in a 99-1 way, but at most a 50-50 way, there will be 50% of jurisdictions that do it. And then what are you going to do? You can reverse the argument on them. You're going to discriminate against that IVF baby? Oh, huh? You think they shouldn't exist, right? And so in general, I think one of the most interesting things about this, by the way, is a dog that didn't bark, which is that tech is in favor of this, right? And that is a huge thing where the builders are in favor of this because we know life is hard enough. Life is there's a lot of difficulties in life, and if somebody has chronic disease, heart disease or something at 50 and they could have not had it, why would you, it's this weird thing where life expectancy, by the way, as you know, was quite low in the 1800s, average life expectancy, because all kinds of infant mortality had not been solved, right? So infant mortality is very high in the past. And as a consequence, some people used to write, and even adult mortality was high, depending on how far back you go, right? And I mean, people within our, great-grandparents' generation, all kinds of modern conveniences from electricity, running water, all kinds of things were just not present. And so, really what it's related to, I think the resistance to embryo screening is part and part, I think, of a broader anti-tech thing within the West, which is like people setting self-driving cars on fire, right? People getting mad about AI, people getting mad about crypto, people getting mad about immigrants taking their jobs, people getting mad about, data centers and their electricity consumption or something like this. People just getting mad about tech at all because tech is changing a lot of things. And they just want, no more, stop. I just want to stop. I want to reverse the world and so on. This is a similar emotion in the late 1800s, early 1900s around the Industrial Revolution. And, because the big belching factories, all the pollution and so on. And to be clear, I'm not saying that there aren't some, like we developed cars and then we developed walkable societies and we took away highways from some parts and so on and so forth. So we developed the thing and we realized we had overdeveloped it somewhat. So we removed some developments, but we kept developing cars because we still did electric cars and self-driving cars and now flying cars, but we also had walkable communities. And so there's a balance between them. And, my view is life is difficult enough. Why roll the dice? Doesn't matter. Why roll the dice when you'd have to? There's going to be 5,000 more dice rolls.
Yeah, you could just get hit by a car. Why do you want to also have to go blind?
Yeah, you can already get hit by lightning. You get hit by a car. You can, there's 5 million other things that can go wrong, right? Why you want to, again, this is the kind of person I think who maybe they don't want to put on their seatbelt, but why do they prevent you from putting on a seatbelt?
Yeah. So what do you think is the steel man? Like, what do you think is the most, I think we talked a lot about the arguments that kind of are just nonsensical. They just result from ignorance of not understanding how the genome works, how IVF works, how, genetic screening works, right? So what do you think are maybe even the most sincere arguments?
Yeah, sure. The steel man would be that far leftists have abused science to call it capital S science and they said masks don't work before they do. And they said that during the BLM riots that racism is a real pandemic after telling everybody to stay inside, and people ran outside. And they call a paper that was published a day ago in Nature, they call that science, capital S science, as if it has the same number of replications as Maxwell's equations, because they equate prestigious citation with they basically substitute prestigious citation for independent replication. Independent replication of what
Capital
science is.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah, like
Yeah, and by the way, those are two totally
more than the replication matters way more than
citation.
how prestigious a journal is. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so the thing is that the peer review basically means like 2 or 3 thumbs ups. It's like if you imagine academia to be a social network where people post papers, 2 or 3 likes from someone in that social network, it's a peer reviewed paper. It's not like it's rare that someone goes and replicates the result. Where they replicate the result is on GitHub, where you git clone and then you try to compile it or build it, right? So that's actually where you get replications. And that's actually the future of what academia is. It looks a lot more like GitHub and reproducible research and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But so because of that, and of course, universities are like 99% Democrat or something like that. And a lot of people have not gotten a share of all this technological progress. And of course, we're also demographically different from a lot of people. We are, so tech is in the US, it's focused on the West Coast. It's focused in cities. It's got a lot of immigrants, got a lot of Indians, Pakistanis, Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, gays, Jews. That's how, the right would consider it foreign. And then for the left, it has too many white men, capitalists, and, so on and so forth. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so both the far left and the far right look at it as alien and different. And the far left emphasizes the capitalism and the right emphasizes the immigrants. And the left doesn't like the economic change and the right doesn't like the cultural change. And they basically just want it to go back to the way it was, very roughly, right? And that is just an overwhelming... Go ahead.
Status quo bias is what you're saying.
More than status quo bias, Unabomber bias, right? What I actually think is going to happen, just to digress for a second, is not even digress. 5 years ago-ish, I realized, and I wrote about this at the time, that after all the Sturm und Drang, that after everything is said and done, the final political axis will be, let's call it, Futurism versus Primitivism, right? They will call it humanism versus transhumanism. Because they'll say, oh my God, transhumanism is so bad, blah, blah, blah. So, and we're just being human. We're being normal, right? Now, the thing is, being a normal human means no electricity, no running water, no light bulbs, and so on and so forth in their heads, okay?
Yeah.
And so, like, there's no way that cities could have the carrying capacity to have a Unabomber lifestyle where he's literally living in the woods. But we do have that as part of our DNA in a literal sense, because we, our common ancestors were similar to chimps. And so we do have millennia of, the outdoors and so on in our DNA in a sense. So there's some, genetic yearning for that, I'm sure. However, there's another interpretation, which is that humanity is actually defined by technology. For example, Richard Wrangham has this book, which is like cooking made us human. Why? Because the fire allowed us to externalize metabolism, so you could spend less energy on your gut and put more to the brain. And then if you take fire, you take weapons like the spear, you take clothes, right? The spear, you don't need fangs. With the clothes, you don't need fur. With a fire, you don't need gut enzymes. And all 3 of them freed up more calories for the brain. And so encephalization quotient just rose across hominids. And, I posted that a while ago. It's like the first singularity. Did you see that? The original singularity.
Oh, this is a good one.
Right?
Yeah, so basically it took, millions of years for, the human brain to evolve. So it's sort of like if you compare that to, GPUs and CPUs, it's like the timescales are very different.
Yeah.
How biology
and by the way, Elon agrees. True. Right?
Yeah.
Boom.
Yeah.
This is the original singularity, right?
Yeah.
And the thing about this is, what that means is since humans began, we have been pushing it into software. So the same process that took all of the, took fangs and turned them into spears and took fur and turned into clothes, and that took gut enzymes turn into fire and pushed everything into the brain to manipulate all these tools is the same thing that's taken all kinds of devices from a camera to a recorder and so on and pushed them into software in the phone. The same kind of thing that's taken all kinds of tools and just pushes them into AI, right? That takes all kinds of stuff and pushes into the screen and into software, and you have less hardware and it's more done in software, right? So we have been doing this concept of push everything into general purpose software has actually been a winning strategy for 10 million years, right? And this also says, actually, what makes us human is the use of technology.
Yeah.
Because an ape can't use a spear. It can jump, along the woods or whatever, right? But or maybe they can use some basic tool use. We understand my point. They can't. Animals, unlike humans, basically can't use technology. Certainly not advanced technology. So actually, technology is what makes us human. And reversing technological progress, stopping let alone reversing it, actually makes us unhuman. It's anti-human, right? So that's why I call them primitivists, because they want to regress to something in the name of doing something natural. They're doing something unnatural, and they're stopping the singularity that actually defines humanity. Right?
Yeah.
So that's actually the crucial reversal, because it's actually, the primitivism is essentially the new version of communism, because communism also appealed to kind of the natural small group sharing and so on and so forth. Primitivism has enough changes to its genetic code that conservatives don't recognize it as communism, even though it's the same thing. If communism was against capitalism, primitivism is against technology. Okay? Yep. But of course, techno-capitalism is a very correlated thing, right?
Yeah.
So we have antibodies to communism because that's against capitalism. So instead of targeting capitalism directly, they'll target technology. And the left will be against the capitalists and the right will be against the immigrants. And the center, a lot of well-meaning Jonathan Haidt type guys, will be against the phones. And the problem is, I understand why they're against the phones, but basically moderated use of phones works in many other cultures around the world. The problem with the West is they don't have any moderation of use of phones for kids and so on and so forth, right? So what happens is you have a collision of values that just don't have any sense to them.
So what do you think is how this is going to play out for reproductive technologies? Like, do you feel like it's going to fall along these similar lines of primitivists versus...
Absolutely. Primitivists versus futurists will be the axis. And it's going to be legal in some important jurisdictions, certainly in tech-forward jurisdictions around the world. The same kinds of places probably that are pro-crypto and have digital nomad visas will probably have, legal embryo screening and so on and so forth. And the same kinds of places that are falling to primitivism of the blue or now the red varieties will probably be against them. Or we don't know. It's unpredictable. It can be very... the future is fragmented, and you will have a lot of different combinations of ideologies that make sense to those individual people versus just a clean left and right. And so at least some of those tribes, some of those jurisdictions will be in favor of technology, and those will probably be some of the best places to be. Usually they'll probably be the places that are prosperous enough and not just prosperous enough, ascending. Ascending jurisdictions are also ascending at the same time the internet is ascending. So they have a positive association with the advance of technology. The West, minus tech, is descending while tech is ascending. So even if they're rich, they're a descending world. And whereas for, let's say, India or, the Philippines, even if it's poor, it's ascending world, right? So that's why developed and developing world is the wrong way of talking about it, because that implies a static developed world and the developing world is maybe moving towards it. Instead, it's the descending world and the ascending world.
Yeah, no. Yeah, that's a great point. So I guess
the ascending world will be pro all of this.
Yeah, so do you want to kind of just summarize what you feel like sort of the the moral cases, sort of what do you think how do you think people are going to see this today, and maybe how do you think that's gonna change over the next couple of years as it becomes more popular?
To reduce it to known moral principles in the West, for the left, it's just reproductive choice.
Yeah.
Point blank. For the right, it is small government and why interfere with, somebody's personal decisions. That's a very short secular political case for it, right? Then you can go and you can quote you make the religious case in terms of doctrine and scriptures and so on and so forth. I don't think many, it may turn out that there's some people who can quote Christianity and so on against this. I can certainly quote Hinduism for it. I'm sure
Yeah.
I could probably find someone who could quote Islam for it, because there's many people in the Middle East who are very pro-embryo screening, many people in the Jewish community who are pro-embryo screening because of, carrier testing. So you could probably find scriptural arguments, I'm sure, usually for or against something, but in general, I think many of the major faith groups could be for it.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that'd be my concise moral argument for it. And then, the thing is, one of the issues is some of the arguments put forward against this are just based on genuinely stupid, reflexive, like an AI,
Mhm.
like association, like this, right?
Yeah.
And they just get mad for the sake of getting mad, and they associate like a grain of sand embryo is the same as a human, is the same as this, is the same as that. And these rhetorical equations simply don't map to the reality. And it's like, oh, isn't it nice to have some chance, the pitter patter of poems? And I think there's a great tweet that you had, which is like, this is like a guy talking about how great it was to pick berries that didn't like the rise of agriculture. It's just, the thing is, that kind of argument is to them very convincing because it
Mhm.
just feels, but feels can't build. Feels can, at best, for them, ban, but feels like doesn't know an A from a C from a T from a G, usually, right?
Mhm.
So they can try to ban in those jurisdictions, and then they just won't be able to do it globally because you can show the poll numbers and so on and so forth. So long as the feels,
No, yeah, I think because I think
the
he makes
primitives,
he made a great argument, right, around that, right? Because it's sort of like, "Hey, we traded electricity for candles, right? We traded cars for horses, right? We traded, um, you know, uh, organ transplants for death, right? We traded epidurals for having, a pregnancy
but the
for."
soldiers with guns were considered really cowardly relative to like soldiers with, knights with swords who'd actually go up and see you and chop you and so on and so forth. Like, today we think of a soldier with a gun as brave, but in the past they were thought of as cowardly because they wouldn't just go up to you and hit you with a sword, right? So moral intuitions do change over time based on the baseline of what people think is, the right thing to do, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think basically pointing out like, hey, what is lost, having babies through sex is like it's basically kind of like the most standard cliche for anti-progress, right? It's like if you only look at what's lost and you don't look at what's gained. I mean, you could make that argument for why don't we hunt our own food with a bow and arrow and putting it at the grocery store? It's
The
like
mac
something's lost, sure, but what is gained, right? Like
The macro argument, I would actually say, is not even really the moral argument. It's a correlational argument.
yeah.
If people feel that their fortunes are just in general declining, which they do in the West, outside tech, they will just be against any kind of change whatsoever, especially from the tech guys. If you're in tech and change is generally being good for you, you'll generally be neutral or positive on change. And if you're in the East or more generally the ascending world, then you're also going to be more positive on tech.
Mhm.
So we should look to tech and the ascending world to legalize this stuff, and we should not look to the descending world to support it. And we just need to divide jurisdictions on that basis. And then it just kind of, like I'm not saying everybody in the descending world will support it, everybody in the descending world will oppose it, but that's the way that you should expect things to play out, right? That's actually the macro above even the moral intuition.
Yeah. So what do you think is so threatening to people about it? Like, why is it like I am genuinely surprised by like the amount of activation. So I don't know. I'm just kind of curious if you feel like you have any
I
to
mean,
say.
well, first is people have been inculcated they literally don't understand what genes are. Like they got mad
Yeah.
at the Sydney Sweeney has great genes ad,
Yeah.
right? Huge numbers of people got mad at this. It's just a pun because they're like, I can't believe you're saying genes could do something. Oh my God, right? So, like, it's, in many ways, American society is like twisted into knots over genetics, over all kinds of things. It's this bizarre kind of thing where I mean, look, there's a lot of wars that kill a lot of people, and they're much less, I don't know. I feel that the concern is one other thing about it is the concern is like it's like it seems like extremely angry on the day that it hits, and then they just move on to the next thing 2 or 3 days later,
Mhm.
right? It is
Yeah.
just very much a passing storm, and if you just keep building, they just don't have the attention span or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
think that's the thing that I think is most, I don't know, I guess makes me feel the best about it actually. It's like basically the benefit to each individual parent is so great that like random, negativity is not enough to convince them, right? It's sort of like for each individual parent, it's the difference between is their child, going to be able to meet their developmental milestones, be able to walk, be able to talk or not. And then for these other people who are kind of, being negative, it's like, they don't really have anything at stake, right? So it does feel like this like really unique part of you know uh healthcare decisions where people actually get to vote with their feet and then decide, hey, like this is the thing that's going to make a difference for me and for my family. And they'll be willing to do that even if there's a lot of loud voices on the other side.
Yes, ma'am. I agree. Okay, cool. All right,
Sweet.
so let me wrap
Thank you.
there. And any last words, any things you want the audience to come away with?
No, I think it's great. I'll send you the slides, and I'll even send you the slide notes too. And then if you want to like AI rejigger them to be whatever content that you want, that'll be great.